Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really getting into some foundational psychological theories, specifically aimed at you, A-level psychology students out there.
Oh,
We
yeah.
want to help you build a really solid understanding of the core concepts you'll definitely need.
Exactly. We've been looking through some great material excerpts from an introduction to psychological theories and concepts. And our mission really is to pull out the key stuff, make those important connections, and hopefully trigger a few of those aha moments for you, without drowning you in detail.
Think of it as your Psychology Essentials toolkit.
Yeah, something like that. A good starting point.
Okay, sounds good. Let's dive in then. We're starting with Albert Bandura's social learning theory. Now, this was a pretty big deal compared to the strict behaviorism that came before, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. A total game changer. Behaviorism, you see, was focused purely on what you could see behaviors and how they were shaped by external rewards or punishments. Bandura, well, he brought the mind, the cognitive part, back into the equation.
Right.
He showed that we can actually learn just by watching other people. You don't necessarily need that direct reinforcement.
And that leads us straight into observational learning and modeling. It's not just simple copying, is it? There's more to it.
Precisely. That's a key distinction. Imitation is just, well, mimicking. Observational learning is deeper. It involves watching a model, someone doing something, and then thinking about it, processing it, and potentially doing it yourself later. It's cognitive.
It requires actual thought.
Definitely. You need to pay attention, remember what you saw, and then decide if you're going to or even can reproduce it.
Okay. And Bandura talked about different types of models influencing us. What were they?
Yeah, he laid out three main types. First, you've got live models, someone physically present, demonstrating the behavior, like the surfing example in our source material.
Okay.
Then there are verbal instructional models. That's when someone explains or describes how to do something. Think of a football coach telling you how to take a penalty.
Right, giving instruction.
Exactly. And finally, symbolic models. These can be characters in books, films, TV shows, or even, public figures we see in the media.
So it's not enough just to see it. You mentioned some necessary steps for this modeling process to actually work.
That's right. Bandura outlined four crucial steps. First is attention. You actually have to notice what the model is doing. Can't learn if you're not watching.
Makes sense.
Second, retention. You need to be able to remember what you observed. Store it away somehow. Third is reproduction. You physically have to be able to perform the behavior yourself. I can watch a gymnast all day, but
Yeah, I'm not going to be doing a backflip anytime soon.
exactly. And finally, and this is really important, motivation. You need a reason to want to copy that behavior.
Ah, motivation. And that's where this idea of vicarious reinforcement fits in. Learning from what happens to other people. It's quite fascinating.
It really is. It's indirect learning. So if you see your model being rewarded or praised for doing something, you're more likely to want to do it too. That's vicarious reinforcement. But if you see them getting punished or told off, you're much less likely to copy them. That's vicarious punishment. And then, of course, if you do try the behavior, your own experience, the direct reinforcement you get, shapes whether you'll do it again.
It really makes you think about things like advertising, doesn't it? Seeing someone happy using a product.
Totally. And it's not just rewards. Bandura also pointed out that how similar we feel to the model matters. We're more drawn to imitate people we identify with, people we see as being like us in some way.
Right, right. Okay, so Bandura didn't just theorize about this, he tested it. The Bobo doll experiment, probably one of the most famous in psychology. What exactly happened there?
Well, in the classic setup, young children watched an adult model interacting with this inflatable Bobo doll. And the adult wasn't just playing nicely, they were being aggressive, hitting it, shouting at it, throwing it around.
Great.
Yeah. But the key variable was what happened to the adult after they were aggressive. In one group of kids, the adult was punished for being aggressive. In another, they were praised. And in a third group, there were no consequences. The aggression was just ignored.
And the results? How did the kids react?
Very telling. The children who saw the adult get punished for being aggressive showed significantly less aggression towards the Bobo doll themselves.
Okay, so punishment worked vicariously.
It seemed to. But the kids who saw the adult being praised, or even just ignored getting away with it, essentially they were much more likely to imitate the aggressive actions. They hit the doll, threw it, even repeated some of the aggressive phrases the adult had used.
Wow. That's a powerful demonstration. So the big takeaway is that we learn by watching, and that learning can push us towards good behaviors, pro-social ones, or not so good ones.
Exactly. On the plus side, kids learn kindness, sharing, cooperation by seeing positive role models. Our source mentions parents, actions speaking louder than words, and inspirational figures like Martin Luther King Jr. or Gandhi.
Mm.
They model pro-social behavior.
But then there's the flip side, the antisocial effects.
Yeah, and this is a really serious point. There's research suggesting a connection between witnessing violence or abuse in childhood and potentially becoming an abuser later on. That statistic, about 30% of abused children potentially becoming abusive parents, it's sobering.
It really highlights the responsibility we have, doesn't it? The influence models can have.
It absolutely does. So Bandura really opened the door to thinking about cognitive processes in learning. Let's shift focus now and look more broadly at the cognitive approach itself, which really centers on these internal mental workings.
Okay. So the cognitive approach is all about what's going on inside our heads, thoughts, memories, beliefs, unlike the learning approaches that just looked at behavior you could see.
Precisely. It puts internal mental processes front and center. Things like memory, perception, how we interpret the world language, attention, our thoughts, our beliefs. The core idea is that how we think directly impacts how we feel and act.
And what drove the need for this cognitive focus? Our source mentioned Noam Chomsky and language.
Right. Chomsky made a really powerful argument against the purely behaviorist view of language learning, the idea that it's all just stimulus, response, and reinforcement. He pointed out that children say things they've never heard before. They make grammatical errors like adding ed to irregular verbs.
Like I goed instead of I went.
Exactly. That suggests they're not just mimicking. They're figuring out underlying rules, creating internal mental models of grammar. This points toward innate cognitive structures, not just learned associations.
And this cognitive thinking isn't just abstract theory, right? It has real-world applications like CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy.
Absolutely. CBT is a hugely influential therapy that comes directly from cognitive principles. It helps people identify and challenge those negative or unhelpful thought patterns and beliefs that often underlie things like anxiety and depression. Change the thinking, change the behavior.
Okay, so digging deeper into the cognitive approach, the idea of schemas keeps popping up. What exactly are schemas?
Think of schemas as mental frameworks, or maybe like mental filing cabinets. They're organized clusters of knowledge, thoughts, and memories about particular topics, objects, situations, people, even ourselves. They help us make sense of incoming information.
And they influence how we think later on.
Massively. They guide our interpretations, expectations, and even our memories. We don't build them from scratch every time. We rely on these existing structures.
How do we get them? Are they learned?
They develop through our experiences, through learning. Importantly, they're heavily influenced by our culture. A child's schemas are quite simple, but as we grow, they become much more complex and interconnected.
The source mentions Piaget's ideas, assimilation and accommodation. How do they relate to schemas?
So assimilation is when you encounter new information that, well, kind of fits neatly into a schema you already have. You just add it in, assimilate it.
Like adding another dog breed to your dog schema.
Exactly. But accommodation is when the new information doesn't fit. It clashes with your existing schema. So you either have to modify that existing schema significantly or maybe even create a whole new one. The example given was a child learning a spider isn't just another type of insect. They need a new spider schema, distinct from the insect one. That requires accommodation.
So schemas affect learning, but also memory. Bartlett's War of the Ghosts study seems crucial here.
Oh, definitely. Bartlett's work was groundbreaking because it showed memory isn't like a video recording faithfully playing back events. It's reconstructive. When his participants tried to recall this unfamiliar Native American folktale, their own cultural schemas kicked in and actively reshaped the story.
How did they reshape it? What were the patterns?
Bartlett found a few consistent patterns. One was assimilation. The story tended to change to become more familiar, more consistent with their own British cultural norms and expectations.
Okay.
Another was leveling. The story got shorter over time. Details that didn't fit their schemas or seemed unimportant were just left out.
Makes sense.
And then there was sharpening. Certain details might be exaggerated or the order of events changed, perhaps to make the story more logical or dramatic, according to their own narrative conventions. Sometimes emotions were added that weren't originally there.
So memory is an active construction site, not a perfect archive, influenced by our schemas.
That's a great way to put it. And it links to another point. Schemas aren't always neutral or helpful. Stereotypes, for instance, are basically schemas about groups of people, often oversimplified, often negative.
Right. And there are other types too?
Yes, the source mentions role schemas are ideas about how someone in a certain role, like a doctor or a teacher, should act. Event schemas, or scripts, are knowledge of the sequence of events in common situations, like going to a restaurant or the movies.
Got it.
And self-schema is all the organized information and beliefs we have about ourselves.
But these schemas, while useful shortcuts, can cause problems.
Yeah, that's the downside. Because they simplify things, they can lead to biases in our thinking, to prejudice. They can also contribute to maladaptive thought patterns, the kind you see in things like depression, anxiety, social phobias, even OCD, where rigid or negative schemas dominate.
And quickly, Bartlett's study strengths and weaknesses.
Well, a strength is that it was a controlled study, and the findings about reconstructive memory have had huge implications, like in eyewitness testimony research. A key weakness, though, is ecological validity. Recalling a strange story in a lab isn't quite the same as how memory works in the real world, is it?
True. Okay, so since we can't directly see these mental processes like schemas, the cognitive approach uses models, right? Theoretical and computer models.
Exactly. Because it's all happening inside the black box of the mind, cognitive psychologists have to infer these processes from behavior. They build theoretical models, which are basically diagrams or theories about how a specific mental process, like memory or attention, might work. Then they test these models.
And the computer analogy became popular.
Hugely influential, especially in the mid-20th century. The idea of the mind as an information processor, taking in input, processing it, producing output, seemed like a powerful way to think about cognition.
Our source mentioned Atkinson and Shiffrin's multi-store model of memory as an early computer-inspired model.
Yes, that's a classic example. It conceptualized memory as flowing through different stores, sensory input, then a short-term working memory buffer, like a computer's RAM, and then potentially into long-term storage, like a hard drive.
But that computer analogy has its limits, doesn't it?
Oh, definitely. A major weakness pointed out is that computers don't think actively or possess consciousness in the human sense. They follow instructions. The complexity of human thought, emotion, intention, it goes way beyond simple information processing.
Which leads us neatly into cognitive neuroscience, trying to link the cognitive processes to the actual brain hardware.
Precisely. Cognitive neuroscience aims to bridge that gap. It takes the theories and tasks from cognitive psychology and looks at the underlying brain activity. A central idea here is materialism, the assumption that every thought, every feeling, every cognitive process has a physical basis in the brain.
And how do they study that? What are the tools?
Brain imaging techniques are key. Functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI, is a major one. It allows researchers to see which parts of the brain are consuming more oxygen, indicating increased activity, while someone performs a cognitive task, like solving a problem or recalling a memory.
So mapping the thinking onto the brain regions.
In essence, yes. Trying to see the brain in action during cognition.
If we go back to that computer analogy for a second, how does cognitive neuroscience sort of map it onto the brain?
Well, the analogy gets extended. The brain itself is seen as the CPU, the central processor. Sensory information is the input. Long-term memory is often compared to the hard disk, and working memory, like Baddeley and Hitch's model, might be analogous to RAM, the active workspace.
But again, limitations crop up.
For sure. One obvious point is that the brain came first. We built computers. AI tries to mimic the brain, not the other way around. And there's the charge of machine reductionism, the danger of oversimplifying the incredible richness and complexity of human thought by reducing it to purely mechanical operations. It misses the subjective experience.
Okay, fascinating stuff. We've looked at how the mind works from a cognitive perspective. Let's shift gears completely now to the biological perspective. Starting with genetics, how does our unique genetic code influence our psychology?
Well, we all inherit a unique genotype, our specific set of genes from our parents. This genotype, interacting with our environment throughout life, contributes to our phenotype, or observable characteristics, both physical and psychological. Genetic variation within a species is also the raw material for evolution.
And it's not just eye color or height, right? Genes can influence behavioral traits too.
Absolutely. Research suggests genetic contributions to personality traits like introversion or extroversion, temperament, even things like sexual orientation and spirituality. And crucially for psychology, there's strong evidence for genetic factors in susceptibility to various psychological disorders, such as schizophrenia or depression.
The source mentioned a specific study, Heston's 1966 adoption study on schizophrenia. What did that show about genes versus environment?
Heston's study was quite clever. It looked at individuals who were adopted away at birth but had a biological mother with schizophrenia, giving them a higher genetic risk. It found that the rate of developing schizophrenia was highest, around 36.8%, in those who had both the high genetic risk, and were raised in a disturbed or dysfunctional adoptive family environment, compared to only about 5.8% in those with high genetic risk, but a healthy family environment.
So it really highlighted that interaction. Genes aren't destiny. Environment plays a critical role too.
Exactly. It's that interplay, the diathesis stress idea. A genetic vulnerability might only manifest under certain environmental conditions.
Okay, sticking with the biological perspective, let's look at evolutionary psychology. This tries to explain our minds and behaviors based on, well, survival and reproduction in the past.
That's the core idea. Evolutionary psychology views psychological traits, ways of thinking, feeling, behaving as adaptations, meaning they evolved through natural selection because they helped our ancestors survive and pass on their genes.
So the assumption is that these behaviors must have some genetic basis to be shaped by evolution.
Yes, for natural selection to act on a trait, there needs to be some heritable component. Evolutionary psychologists often work by predicting how we should behave in certain situations if a trait evolved for a specific purpose, and then they test those predictions. But, importantly, just showing a behavior is adaptive now doesn't automatically prove its evolutionary origin or genetic basis.
And studying this is tricky, right? Looking back into the distant past.
Very tricky. One major challenge is understanding the specific environmental and social pressures our ancestors faced, the environment of evolutionary adaptiveness. We can only make educated guesses. Plus, a trait that was adaptive then might not be adaptive now, or might even be maladaptive in our modern world.
But despite the challenges, evolutionary psychology has tried to explain quite a range of human behaviors.
Oh, yes. Everything from memory biases, mate selection preferences, altruism towards kin, cooperation, aggression, parenting strategies, even social hierarchies. They try to find the adaptive logic behind these patterns.
The source brings up another piece of genetic research relevant here, Gottesman's 1991 twin study meta-analysis on schizophrenia. What were the findings there?
Gottesman combined data from many twin studies. The key finding was the concordance rate, the probability that if one twin has schizophrenia, the other does too. For identical twins, MZ twins, who share 100% of their genes, the rate was about 48%. For fraternal twins, DZ twins, who share about 50% of genes like regular siblings, it was only about 17%.
That's a big difference. Suggests a strong genetic link.
A very strong genetic component, yes. But notice, it's not 100% even for identical twins. That clearly tells us that genetics isn't the whole story. Other factors, environmental, maybe epigenetic, must also be involved.
And what about the evaluation of Gottesman's work, strengths and weaknesses?
The main strength is the sheer amount of data analyzed, making the finding very robust and reliable. A limitation often raised, though, is the equal environments assumption. Identical twins might not only share more genes, but also experience more similar environments and be treated more alike than fraternal twins, which could artificially inflate the concordance rate attributed purely to genetics.
Right, that's always a tricky factor in twin studies. Okay, let's shift from the what of genes and evolution to the where, the brain itself. The case of Phineas Gage back in 1848 is a classic starting point for understanding brain function localization.
It's an incredible story, really. Gage had that terrible accident where an iron tamping rod went straight through his prefrontal cortex. Miraculously, he survived, but his personality changed dramatically. He became impulsive, unreliable, socially inappropriate.
So it suggested that specific part of the brain, the frontal lobe, was crucial for those functions: decision-making, personality, social behavior.
Exactly. Before we had sophisticated brain scanning, these kinds of tragic, natural experiments provided some of the earliest evidence that different brain regions have specialized functions.
And now, of course, we do have those sophisticated techniques. The source listed quite a few: ERPs, MEG, EEG, fMRI. Can you give a quick sense of what they do?
Sure. They all measure brain activity in different ways.
Yeah.
P scans track radioactive tracers to see metabolic activity. EEG and MEG measure electrical or magnetic fields produced by neuronal activity, giving great timing information. ERPs are specific EEG patterns linked to particular events, and fMRI, as we mentioned, tracks blood flow changes related to activity, giving good spatial information where things are happening.
And the McGuire et al. Study on London taxi drivers is a brilliant example, using MRI to show brain plasticity, right? The brain changing with experience.
It really is fascinating. McGuire and her team used MRI scans, which show brain structure, and found that experienced London taxi drivers who have to memorize that incredibly complex map of London, the knowledge had a significantly larger posterior hippocampus compared to control subjects.
And the hippocampus is involved in spatial memory and navigation.
Precisely. And even more compelling, the size of this difference correlated with how long they'd been driving a taxi. It strongly suggested that the extensive spatial learning and practice actually caused structural changes in their brains. A fantastic demonstration of neuroplasticity.
Wow. Okay, we've covered cognitive and biological angles. Now for another major shift. Sigmund Freud and the psychodynamic approach. Let's start with his model of personality, the id, ego, and superego.
Right. Freud's model is probably one of the most famous, if controversial, in all of psychology. He proposed this structure operating at different levels of consciousness, often visualized as an iceberg, with most of it, the unconscious, hidden below the surface.
So the conscious mind is just the tip.
Exactly. And within this structure, he described three interacting components. The id is the completely unconscious primal part present from birth. It runs on the pleasure principle, demanding immediate gratification of basic drives and instincts. Think hunger, thirst, sex, aggression.
Okay, the demanding baby part.
Kind of, yeah. Then there's the ego. It develops as the child interacts with reality. The ego operates on the reality principle, trying to mediate between the id's unrealistic demands, the constraints of the external world, and later, the moral demands of the superego. It's the decision maker, mostly conscious.
The mediator and the superego.
The superego develops last, around age 5, by internalizing the moral standards and values of parents and society. It operates on the morality principle, essentially our conscience. It has two parts: the conscience itself, which makes us feel guilty for doing wrong, and the ego ideal, which represents our aspirations, the kind of person we want to be.
And Freud believed these parts are often in conflict, leading to anxiety and defense mechanisms.
Yes, conflict is central to his theory. The ego is constantly trying to balance the competing demands of the impulsive id and the moralistic superego, all while dealing with reality. When this conflict creates too much anxiety for the ego to handle consciously, it resorts to defense mechanisms.
Which distort reality.
Unconsciously, yes. They protect the ego from anxiety by distorting reality in various ways. Repression is a key one, pushing threatening thoughts or memories out of conscious awareness. Denial is refusing to acknowledge an unpleasant reality. Displacement is shifting feelings from their original target onto a safer one. There are many others.
The source mentions Freud's case study of little Hans as an example of displacement linked to the Oedipus complex. Can you unpack that?
So little Hans was a young boy with a phobia of horses. Freud, analyzing notes from the boy's father, interpreted this not as a realistic fear, but as a displaced fear. He theorized Hans was experiencing the Oedipus complex unconscious sexual desire for his mother and fear of his father as a rival. Because fearing his father directly was too threatening, the anxiety was displaced on the horses, which Freud linked symbolically to the father.
Okay. That interpretation is quite specific. What about the evaluation of this case study method?
Well, the strength of case studies like Little Hans is they provide incredibly rich, detailed qualitative data about an individual. And Freud's work, driven by these studies, was hugely influential in developing psychotherapy, the talking cure.
But the weaknesses?
Big weaknesses. It's very difficult to generalize findings from one unique individual to the wider population. Freud's interpretations were highly subjective and based on his specific theories, like the Oedipus complex, which are almost impossible to scientifically prove or disprove. They're largely unfalsifiable. And critics argued there were often simpler, more plausible explanations for Hans's phobia, like maybe he just had a frightening experience with a horse.
Right. Okay, Freud didn't just stop at personality structure. He also proposed stages of psychosexual development.
Yes, another cornerstone of his theory. He believed personality develops through a sequence of 5 stages in childhood: oral, anal, phallic, latency, and genital. In each stage, pleasure-seeking energies, the libido, become focused on a different erogenous zone of the body.
And problems in a stage could lead to fixation.
That was the idea. If a child's needs weren't appropriately met during a particular stage, either too much gratification or too little, they could become fixated at that stage, and aspects of that stage's conflicts would carry forward and manifest in their adult personality.
Can you just briefly outline the stages and potential fixations?
Sure. The oral stage, birth to about 1 year, pleasure is centered on the mouth sucking, biting, feeding. Fixation might lead to issues like smoking, overeating, nail biting, or maybe being overly dependent or sarcastic.
Okay.
The anal stage, around 1 to 3 years, pleasure focuses on bowel and bladder control during toilet training. Fixation could lead to being anal retentive, obsessively neat, orderly controlling or anal expulsive, messy, disorganized, rebellious.
Right.
The phallic stage, around 3 to 6 years, pleasure shifts to the genitals. This is where Freud placed the Oedipus complex in boys and Electra complex in girls, the unconscious desires for the opposite sex parent and rivalry with the same-sex parent. Fixation here could lead to vanity, recklessness, or issues with relationships and authority.
Then there's a quiet period.
Yes, the latency stage, from about 6 to puberty. Sexual feelings are largely dormant and the child focuses on social skills, friendships, schoolwork.
And fine.
The genital stage, from puberty onwards. Sexual urges reawaken, directed towards peers rather than parents. If the previous stages were navigated successfully, the individual develops mature sexual interests and the capacity for healthy adult relationships.
This whole theory is pretty controversial, isn't it? And very much a product of its time.
Hugely controversial, yes. And absolutely influenced by the sexually repressed Victorian era Freud lived in. He often linked psychological problems or neuroses to unresolved unconscious conflicts stemming from these early psychosexual experiences. While incredibly influential historically, the theory lacks strong empirical support and relies heavily on subjective interpretation. Modern psychology has largely moved beyond it, though some concepts still resonate.
It's certainly a contrast to our next perspective, humanism, which offers a much more positive view, focusing on potential and free will.
A complete shift in perspective, really. Humanistic psychology emphasizes the individual's inherent goodness, their potential for personal growth, and their capacity for conscious choice free will. It focuses on subjective experience, the here and now.
And key ideas here are congruence and conditions of worth.
Yes. Carl Rogers, a major figure, talked about congruence. That's the match or alignment between your self-concept, how you currently see yourself, and your ideal self, the person you'd like to be. The closer the match, the higher your sense of self-worth and the closer you are to self-actualization.
And incongruence is the gap.
Exactly. A big gap between your perceived self and ideal self leads to incongruence, which can cause anxiety and low self-worth. Conditions of worth are related to this. These are the requirements we feel we have to meet to be loved or valued by others. I'll only be loved if I get good grades or if I behave a certain way.
So love with strings attached.
Pretty much. And Rogers argued these conditions of worth can really damage our self-concept, forcing us to act in ways that aren't true to ourselves just to gain approval, leading to incongruence.
Which is why unconditional positive regard is so important in this theory.
Crucial. Unconditional positive regard is offering love, acceptance, and support without any strings attached, regardless of the person's behavior. Rogers believed this was essential for healthy psychological development, allowing a person to develop a positive self-concept and move towards self-actualization. His person-centered therapy is built around providing this.
Okay, let's bring in Abraham Maslow, another giant of humanism, famous for his hierarchy of needs.
Maslow proposed this pyramid structure representing human motivations. The idea is that we have different levels of needs, and we're driven to satisfy the lower-level, more basic needs first before we can focus on the higher-level ones.
Can you walk us up the pyramid?
Sure. At the bottom are the physiological needs: air, food, water, shelter, sleep. The absolute basics for survival. Once those are reasonably met, we move up to safety needs: security, stability, order, freedom from fear.
Okay, physical survival and safety first.
Then come love and belongingness needs: friendship, intimacy, family, a sense of connection. After that, esteem needs: self-esteem, achievement, competence, respect from others, recognition.
And right at the very top.
Self-actualization. This is about fulfilling your unique potential, becoming everything you're capable of being. Maslow saw this as an ongoing process, not a final destination, and believed relatively few people fully achieve it. He even listed characteristics he observed in people he considered self-actualized.
So the idea is you can't really worry about achieving your potential if you're starving or feel unsafe.
That's the core principle, generally speaking. Basic needs demand attention first. Though Maslow acknowledged the levels aren't always perfectly rigid, and needs can interact.
And the source mentions some criticisms.
Yes, it's been criticized for being perhaps too simplistic, maybe culturally biased towards Western individualistic values. It's also subjective. Defining self-actualization is difficult, and there are real-world examples where people seem to sacrifice lower needs for higher ideals. Think of activists going on hunger strike.
Right, and Maslow himself later added another level.
He did. Towards the end of his life, he proposed self-transcendence as a level above self-actualization. This involves finding meaning and purpose by dedicating oneself to causes beyond the self: altruism, spirituality, contributing to the greater good. Gandhi's actions might fit here.
There was a study mentioned Aronoff's research on cane cutters and fishermen relating to the hierarchy.
Yes, Aronoff studied workers in the West Indies. He found that fishermen who had more job security and higher pay, satisfying lower needs more easily, tended to show concerns higher up Maslow's hierarchy, like esteem needs. Cane cutters, with less security and lower pay, were more focused on lower-level safety and physiological needs. This seemed to support the basic structure of the theory.
But limited by being in one culture.
That's a fair limitation, yes. Cultural context always matters.
Okay, finally, let's quickly touch on Carl Rogers again, specifically his therapeutic approach.
Rogers, as we said, really believed in people's innate drive towards growth. His client-centered therapy, later called person-centered therapy, reflects this. The client, not the therapist, is seen as the expert on their own life and directs the course of therapy.
And the therapist's role is crucial, but specific.
Very specific. Rogers identified 3 core conditions the therapist must provide for growth to occur. Unconditional positive regard, which we discussed, genuine caring and acceptance. Genuineness or congruence, the therapist being authentic and transparent. And empathy, understanding the client's world from their point of view.
And does it work? The Gibbard and Hanley study evaluated it.
Yes, their evaluation over 5 years looked at person-centered therapy for common issues like anxiety and depression. They found it had a significant positive effect, suggesting it is indeed an effective therapeutic approach for many people.
Any limitations noted in that study?
They did mention the potential hello-goodbye effect. Clients might unconsciously exaggerate problems when they start therapy and minimize them when they finish, which could inflate the perceived effectiveness slightly. But overall, the findings were positive.
Well, that brings us to the end of this pretty packed deep dive. We've journeyed through social learning, the cognitive approach with schemas and models, the biological perspective, looking at genetics, evolution, and the brain itself, Freud's psychodynamic ideas, and finally, the humanistic focus on potential and growth. Quite a landscape. Hopefully that's given you A-level students a clearer map.
Absolutely. There's a lot to take in, but understanding these different lenses, these foundational theories, is so crucial for making sense of human behavior and mental processes as you go deeper into psychology. Each offers a unique perspective, even if they sometimes disagree.
So, to leave you with something to think about, pick an everyday behavior you see, or maybe a current social issue that interests you. How might these different approaches, say, the cognitive versus the evolutionary, or the psychodynamic versus the humanistic, try to explain it? Thinking about those contrasting explanations is a great way to really solidify your understanding and start thinking critically like a psychologist.